Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest episode of the foXnoMad podcast. I'm your host, foXnoMad Donald Polat. My guest today is Dr. Daniel Haulman. He is a retired United States Air Force historian, and he has written several books about the Tuskegee Airmen. He is one of the world's top experts on the Tuskegee Airmen, so we talk about who the Tuskegee Airmen were, some of their history, and their legacy and impact today. I think you're really going to enjoy this episode with Dr. Haulman. Hi, Dr. Haulman. Thanks for being a guest on the podcast. I appreciate you
Thank you
taking the
for your
time.
invitation. Thank you for your invitation.
So the Tuskegee Airmen is something I have read about and was fascinated with. I think there was a time, where I really wanted to be a pilot. So I was reading about all of these stories, and it came back up again in the news recently. So I wanted to bring on somebody who knows a lot about the Tuskegee Airmen to kind of give us some background about things we might not know about this important piece of history. First, I guess just to start, what is your background and how did you become a historian on this subject matter?
I was an Air Force historian working at the Air Force Historical Research Agency at Maxwell Air Force Base for a total of 37 years until I retired in 2019. And the Air Force Historical Research Agency is the chief repository of historical documents relating to Air Force units, such as squadrons and groups and wings and so on. And the Tuskegee Airmen were members of various organizations, such as the 99th Fighter Squadron, 100th, 301st, 302nd Fighter Squadrons, the 332nd Fighter Group, and so on. So the reason I'm able to speak with some confidence about the Tuskegee Airmen record is because I'm so familiar with the documents and their unit histories, which they kept themselves. They wrote themselves during World War II.
And what does that look like? I mean, what did it look like back then? In other words, keeping records for historical purposes. What do those records look like? What kind of information was kept, and what kind of information do you have access to?
Well, one of the things President Franklin D. Roosevelt did, and he was, of course, president starting in 1933 and all the way until 1945 when he died. He was president during the Great Depression and the president during most of World War II for the United States. And one of the things he mandated was for the armed forces to keep records of the various units that participated in their military campaigns. And so historians were appointed in these various units to keep the records. The records are not the same quality for all the different units. It depended on who the assigned person was keeping the histories, but it was the members of the units themselves that kept the records of the units. And usually those records were kept by month. For example, a squadron in World War II in the Army Air Forces, the smallest unit was generally a squadron. And a squadron was assigned to a group, and a group was assigned to a wing. Well, the squadrons would keep monthly histories, and they would usually send their histories to the group historian. And the group historian would sometimes put those histories together in a monthly group history. And so we have not only the histories of squadrons, but the histories of the groups to which they belong. And that's also true of the Tuskegee Airmen units.
And do the records contain things aside from, I would assume things like, losses, victories? Do they contain personal information as well? Do we get some more information like that?
There are other documents at the Air Force Historical Research Agency besides unit histories. For example, they have histories of numbered air forces. And in many of these cases, the 332nd Fighter Group, for example, in 1944, middle of 1944, was assigned to the 15th Air Force. And the 15th Air Force had other documents, statistical type documents relating to orders that awarded victory credits for shooting down enemy aircraft, or orders that awarded distinguished flying crosses or distinguished unit citations. There were also records of mission reports. If 15th Air Force launched a mission against a target, for example, in Germany in 1945, then it had this narrative mission report that included information about all the organizations, such as groups and squadrons, that took part in that mission. So there's plenty of information about units, about missions, about awards, about aerial victory credits. There's even some oral histories with people who had participated in these campaigns or participated in these units, including oral histories with Tuskegee Airmen themselves. One thing the agency doesn't have a lot of, though, is personnel documentation. For example, if you were an individual Tuskegee Airman and you weren't the commander of one of these units, there wouldn't be a lot of information about you, personnel information, because most of the personnel information of the members of the armed forces during World War II is at the National Archives facility in St. Louis, Missouri. It's the National Personnel Records Center. So if you wanted information about a Tuskegee Airman unit or a leader of a Tuskegee Airman unit, you could go to the Air Force Historical Research Agency at Maxwell Air Force Base. But if you wanted information about an individual Tuskegee Airman who wasn't a commander of a unit, just a pilot, you wouldn't find a lot of individual information on him at the agency. You would find more individual information, personnel, and personal information at the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis. And I believe that the National Archives facility there limits access to some of those individual records to members of the family.
Interesting. And so what got you interested in the Tuskegee Airmen? Did your, research begin there, or is it something that came later on and you became interested in it?
Well, that's a good question. I worked at the Air Force Historical Research Agency for many years, and one of the people I worked with was Joseph Caver, an African American archivist, and also with another historian, Jerome Ennals. And Jerome Ennals was also African American, a historian. And we worked together at the agency for several years and got to know each other. And their interest was in the Tuskegee Airmen. They decided that they wanted to produce a book about the Tuskegee Airmen. And it was designed mainly to be a coffee table type book with photographs and captions. It was mostly going to be photographs and captions. But in the meantime, I had done a lot of Tuskegee Airmen research because one of my responsibilities as a historian at the Air Force Historical Research Agency was to keep track of all the aerial victory credits of Air Force pilots, whether they were members of the Air Service in World War I, or the Army Air Forces in World War II, or the Air Force after 1947. So we had records of the individual claims of the pilots and how many aircraft they shot down. One of the reasons I started research into the Tuskegee Airmen is because we had a question about Lee Archer, a Tuskegee Airman, who some claim was an ace. An ace is somebody who shot down at least 5 enemy aircraft. And the question was Lee Archer an ace? Because according to the official records, he was listed with 4 aerial victory credits instead of 5, which would mean he was not an ace. Well, I was assigned to keep track of questions like that, not only questions about Lee Archer, but other pilots who claimed to have had more victory credits than were actually listed. And so I researched Lee Archer's case, and I came to the conclusion that he had 4 aerial victory credits. He shot down 3 in July of 1944 and another in October of 1944. And he had a total of 4, and we didn't have any documentation of any additional claims by him during World War II or any aerial victories that had actually been awarded to him. So I wrote an article about that, based on that, in probably around 2005, 2006. And the article was about the aerial victory credits of the Tuskegee Airmen, and I included Lee Archer. who shot down 3 enemy aircraft in one day and who shot down another on another day. So he had 4 aerial victory credits, but I had all the Tuskegee Airmen aerial victory credits. And there were 112 enemy aircraft shot down by Tuskegee Airmen during World War II. So I wrote that article. But in the process of researching that article and looking at all the narrative mission reports, I discovered that the familiar claim, at the time there was a familiar claim back in 2006, that the Tuskegee Airmen on their bomber escort missions had never lost a bomber to enemy aircraft. And I believed it myself because I had heard it for years, and Joe Kaver had mentioned it, and Jerome Ennals had mentioned it. So I thought it was true. But when I did my research and looked at the narrative mission reports and looked at the other documents about missing air crew reports from the bomber crews, bomber organizations, I discovered that the claim was false, that there were some cases where Tuskegee Airmen escorted bombers were shot down by enemy aircraft. So I included that at the end of my paper about the aerial victory credits. And I presented that paper at a history conference at Kansas State University in Manhattan, Kansas, back around 2006 or 2005. I think it was 2006. And it wasn't very controversial when I revealed that the claim that the Tuskegee Airmen had never lost a bomber was false. It wasn't very controversial among fellow historians, but it became very controversial later. In December of 2006, I was contacted by a reporter of the Montgomery Advertiser, the local newspaper in Montgomery, Alabama. And he said he had learned that I had discovered that the never lost a bomber claim of the Tuskegee Airmen, or about the Tuskegee Airmen, was false. And I told him, well, that's true. I wasn't the only one to come to that conclusion. There was a Black historian named Bill Holton, who had been a veteran of World War II, but in the Navy. He had been in the Tuskegee Airmen Incorporated. He was very interested in the Tuskegee Airmen. And he had come to the conclusion that some bombers under Tuskegee Airmen escort were shot down by enemy aircraft even before I did. And when I mentioned that at a staff meeting at work one day, and Joe Kaver was in the meeting, I told him I had discovered that sometimes bombers under Tuskegee Airmen escort was shot down by enemy aircraft. And Joe Kaver told me that Bill Holton had already come to that conclusion. And so Bill Holton and I got in touch with each other, and we realized we were looking at the same documents and coming to the same conclusions. Well, that wasn't real controversial yet, but when Al Ben, the reporter from the Montgomery Advertiser, called me in December 2006, he wanted to do an interview about what he thought was a big story. And so he interviewed me, and I told him about Bill Holton coming to the same conclusion, both a white historian and a Black historian coming to the same conclusion. He wrote an article in the Montgomery Advertiser that spread like wildfire with the Associated Press. And the next week and the week after that and the week after that, the rest of 2006 and December 2006, it was a big story nationwide. And the reason it was a big story is because so many people had accepted the claim that the Tuskegee Airmen had never lost a bomber. I wasn't trying to discredit the Tuskegee Airmen in any way. I wasn't trying to dishonor them in any way. I just wanted to explain what the record showed. So that's how I got involved in Tuskegee Airmen history. And later on, I decided to expand my research and create a chronology about the Tuskegee Airmen because I knew that George Lucas, the famous maker of the Star Wars movies, was going to be working on a Red Tails movie, a movie about the Tuskegee Airmen, and that they would be sending representatives to the agency to do a little research before they did the movie. I was going to be one of the historians to meet with them and talk with them and show them what we had. And so I created this chronology primarily for the George Lucas people to do the movie. when Joseph Caver and Jerome Reynolds, who were preparing this coffee table book with pictures and captions, discovered that I had created this chronology of Tuskegee Airmen history, they asked me if I wanted to be a co-author and they could put the chronology in the book. And that's how the first Tuskegee Airmen book I wrote came about. It was a book I co-authored with Joseph Caver and Jerome Reynolds. So the three of us, two black and one white, wrote this book about the Tuskegee Airmen called The Tuskegee Airmen, An Illustrated History.
And so it seems like, throughout the history, there have been some myths, right? And we just talked about one about Tuskegee. What are some things that are known? Who were the Tuskegee Airmen and how did they come to be?
The Tuskegee Airmen were the first black pilots in American military service. And it was very important historically because before that, black pilots were not allowed in the Air Corps. In the Air Service during World War I, blacks were not allowed to serve as pilots. In the Air Corps, which started in 1926 from the Air Service, there were no pilots, no black pilots until the Tuskegee Airmen. So the 1940 decision by Franklin D. Roosevelt to start having blacks serve as pilots in American military service, in the Air Corps, in what later became the Army Air Forces. Roosevelt's decision led to the training of black pilots within the military. The place chosen for that training was Tuskegee, partly because of the climate. There were a lot more good days of flying weather in Tuskegee than in other places. And partly because Tuskegee Institute at the time, now it's Tuskegee University, but Tuskegee Institute was well known as one of the leading institutions of black higher education in the country. And so they lobbied for the place where the black pilots would be trained. And another reason was because the pilots would be trained on a segregated basis. The black pilots would be trained separate from the white pilots because of the segregation at the time, even within the military. Even though the Army Air Forces had never trained black pilots before, the Air Corps had not done it before. When they did start to do it, they did it on a segregated basis. So that's how the Tuskegee Airmen came to be. They trained at Moton Field, which is an airfield, now the Tuskegee Airport, now the Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site. Moton Field was where the primary flight training took place. But the basic and advanced flight training, the next two phases of flight training before somebody actually got his wings as a military pilot, were at Tuskegee Army Airfield, which was several miles to the northwest of Moton Field. Moton Field was an institution, part of Tuskegee Institute, but Tuskegee Army Airfield was not. It was military. And so it was a much bigger base. And that's where the Tuskegee Airmen pilots, the first black pilots in American military service, got their training.
And where did the pilots come from? I'm imagining, if there's so much segregation, were these, fresh cadets? Like, did they have flight experience before? Were they civilian pilots prior?
That's a
Where were
good
they?
question, too. One of the things that Franklin Roosevelt did before pilots were trained as military pilots in American military service was there was a civilian pilot training program. And the civilian pilot training program was not only for whites, but also for blacks. And several institutions, about 6 institutions around the country, trained civilian black pilots. And many of the first military trainees came from these civilian pilot training schools. One of those civilian pilot training schools was at Tuskegee Institute, but it wasn't the only place. So when the first black military pilots came, many of them had civilian pilot training at one of these other locations or at Tuskegee itself. And they came from all over the country. Eventually, of course, there were a lot of other black pilots who even didn't have civilian pilot training, but who wanted to be pilots. And so they went to uh, Tuskegee to train to be military pilots. So not all of them had civilian pilot training before they started.
And when the program began, what was the reception to it, both in the military and maybe, in the public? Was this seen as sort of, were there a lot of people who were hoping it for success, or maybe didn't think that these pilots would see combat? I'm curious what the mood was, both inside and outside the military.
It depends on who the person was. There was a lot of support for the training of Black military pilots, especially among Black communities all over the United States, and in some white communities as well. There were a lot of places where there was support for more opportunities for Black people to have equal opportunities with white people. But there was a lot of opposition too. There was even opposition. Well, of course, there was opposition in some parts of the South. There were still some people who believed that Blacks were inferior and that they wouldn't make good pilots. And for some of them, this was an experiment. The commander of Tuskegee Army Airfield during most of World War II was a man named Colonel Noel Parrish. He was a Southerner, but he believed that Blacks should be given equal opportunities to whites. And to him, it wasn't an experiment. To him, he was going to be training Black military pilots, and he wanted those Black military pilots to eventually be able to deploy overseas and participate in combat. So in the minds of somebody like Colonel Noel Parrish, a white Southern officer from Kentucky originally, who was leading Tuskegee Army Airfield and had a lot of white staff members who were helping train the Black pilots, they wanted the pilots that were trained at Tuskegee to be just as well trained as the white pilots being trained at other places, and also wanted them to deploy overseas and participate in combat and be given the same opportunities. There was a lot of resistance to that, and within the War Department. And eventually, after the first Black pilots were trained, the first Black pilots in American military service graduated in March of 1941. But the first, I'm sorry, 1942. And then in 1943, about a year later, was when the first Black flying unit, the 99th Pursuit Squadron, which became the 99th Fighter Squadron, finally went overseas. A year later, it had gotten enough pilots to be able to go overseas well before that, but it took a year. And then the 332nd Fighter Group, which included the 100th, 301st, and 302nd Fighter Squadrons, took another year before they could deploy overseas. So the first Black flying unit went overseas in the spring of 1943. Three other Black fighter squadrons in the 332nd Fighter Group deployed overseas at the beginning of 1944. So it took a long time for them to be actually given the opportunity to serve overseas in combat.
And for these pilots, what would a combat mission look like? So in other words, how are they preparing? Is it, as we imagine dogfighting, I know they're bomber escorts. What kind of things were they preparing for? And when they got overseas, what did the missions look like?
Well, at first, the Tuskegee Airmen were not escorting bombers. At first, the 99th Fighter Squadron went overseas and they were flying P-40s in support of ground forces and surface forces over the Mediterranean and over Sicily and over southern Italy. They were flying P-40s for the 12th Air Force, and the 12th Air Force was basically helping provide ground support and interdiction for the ground surface forces. When the 332nd Fighter Group went overseas and deployed to Italy, at first the 99th Fighter Squadron with its P-40s was not assigned to it. The 332nd Fighter Group and its other three fighter squadrons were flying P-39 aircraft. And the P-39 aircraft, like the P-40, wasn't really designed for air-to-air combat. It was designed to support ground forces. So at first, the Tuskegee Airmen didn't have the opportunity to fly in dogfighting type missions. Their main responsibility was close air support and interdiction, and not air-to-air combat. It wasn't until the summer of 1944 that the 99th Fighter Squadron was assigned to the 332nd Fighter Group that already had three fighter squadrons assigned to it. So the 99th, 100th, 301st, and 302nd Fighter Squadrons were assigned to the 332nd Fighter Group. That was one revolutionary thing that happened in the middle of 1944. Another was that the 332nd Fighter Group was reassigned from the 12th Air Force to the 15th Air Force. The 15th Air Force had bombers, B-17 and B-24 bombers. So the mission of the Tuskegee Airmen, the 332nd Fighter Group and its four squadrons, changed from supporting ground forces and interdiction missions to protecting the bombers, which involved air-to-air combat, more air-to-air combat. And so that's when everything changed, and they started flying more missions to protect the bombers, to escort the bombers, and if the bombers were threatened, to go after enemy aircraft.
And what was the reason for the change? Is there a specific reason? Is that typical for combat pilots to kind of start in that order?
Good question. I think there were two reasons. One of them was because the 15th Air Force had 21 bombardment groups. It only had 6 fighter groups to support those 21 bomber groups at first. So they wanted to assign another group for bomber escort, a 7th group. And when they looked for which group to assign, another reason the 332nd Fighter Group was chosen was because it was black, to give blacks an opportunity to fly with the 6 white fighter groups that were also escorting bombers for the 15th Air Force. And they had an extra squadron. So they had more pilots and more planes. So they were killing 2 birds with 1 stone. They were not only assigning another group for fighter escort of bombers, so they'd have 7 fighter escort groups for 21 bombardment groups, but also they were giving this black group, which had an extra squadron. Most of the fighter groups had 3 squadrons. The Tuskegee Airmen had 4 squadrons. The 332nd Fighter Group had 4 squadrons. So they were adding more pilots to that mission. Of course, it was a new mission for the black pilots, and they had to learn different types of missions because they were escorting bombers for a change. They were elated about it because it gave them the opportunity to fly over enemy territory, to encounter enemy aircraft, and to shoot down enemy aircraft.
And how dangerous were these missions in the sense that what was a successful mission? What did that look like? And what are their chances of getting, shot down? It seems like a very high risk, right? Because you're protecting the bomber and being attacked from all sides. What did those missions look like?
It depended on the day, and it depended on the target. On certain days, it was a lot more difficult than other days. So it depended on the day, and it depended on the target. Sometimes, for example, I think it was July 17th, 1944, which was just about a month after the Tuskegee Airmen started escorting bombers. There were Tuskegee Airmen in the 332nd Fighter Group that were escorting bombers of the 15th Air Force to a target in Germany to bomb a German airfield. And when they took off, they were flying over the Adriatic Sea, and they encountered enemy aircraft in northern Italy. And about half of the Tuskegee Airmen dropped their fuel tanks, their auxiliary fuel tanks, to give them more speed and maneuverability to be able to fight these enemy aircraft that were threatening the bombers. That was good. They drove off the enemy aircraft, protected the bombers. But unfortunately, those planes that dropped their fuel tanks didn't have enough fuel to go all the way to the target and back. So they had to turn around and go back to their home base at Ramatelli airfield in Italy. So that left only half of the fighters that were originally launched by the 332nd Fighter Group to continue to escort the bombers to the target. When they got to the target, not only did they have only half of the fighters that were originally escorting the bombers, but the Germans sent up many more planes than they had in the 332nd Fighter Group fighters that were over the target. So they were outnumbered not only by the number of bombers they had to protect, but also by the number of enemy aircraft that came to shoot down the bombers. And that was the day the Tuskegee Airmen lost more bombers than any other day because they were outnumbered. It was very understandable. It wasn't because of lack of skill, it was because they were outnumbered. So they lost many bombers. They lost some of their own men that day. There were several Tuskegee Airmen shot down. I don't remember the exact number. It might have been in the range of the 80s that were shot down during World War II. And many of them became prisoners of war. There were 32, I believe, 32 Tuskegee Airmen who became prisoners of war after they were shot down on missions. But let me first say that not all of the missions they flew were bomber escort missions, even after they were assigned to the 15th Air Force. Some of their missions were strafing missions, attacking targets on the ground, and some of them were escorting reconnaissance flights and things like that.
And so I imagine to be a combat pilot in those circumstances, there has to be a certain type of character, right? That seems very, that seems both dangerous, high adrenaline. Do we know a lot about, the what happened once people began their combat missions? Do we have records of, their experiences and what it was like for them?
Yes, we do. There's a lot of records. We don't have only the unit records and the mission reports and the orders that awarded victory credits and the orders that awarded honors like Distinguished Flying Crosses. We also have records from the Tuskegee Airmen themselves. Some of the Tuskegee Airmen wrote autobiographies. Harold Brown wrote an autobiography, and Harry Stewart, who recently passed away at the age of 100, wrote an autobiography. Alexander Jefferson, one of those POWs that I mentioned earlier, wrote an autobiography. Uh, uh, Dryden, Charles Dryden wrote an autobiography. So many of the Tuskegee Airmen wrote autobiographies, and some of them conducted oral history interviews that were recorded about their own experiences. And many of them have very heroic stories about their individual training and what motivated them to want to be a pilot and fly in combat for their country. And it's very heroic to read their stories
And
and to listen.
yeah, and I'm curious now after the war, how does this change the Air Force? How does the Tuskegee Airmen, how does this program change things, or does it?
It did change things, not immediately. There was the Tuskegee Airmen flew in combat through the end of April 1945. And then, of course, the war ended in Europe in May of 1945. The Tuskegee Airmen fighter pilots did not participate in combat in the Pacific theater. There were a few Tuskegee Airmen pilots who were liaison pilots who did fly with some Army units on islands in the Pacific, but most of the Tuskegee Airmen were either bomber pilots or fighter pilots. The bomber pilots never deployed overseas. Some of the Tuskegee Airmen trained to be B-25 bomber pilots, but they stayed within the United States. But to get to your question about how it changed the Air Force was born in 1947, 2 years after the World War II ended. In the next year, 1948, President Harry Truman issued Executive Order 9981 that mandated the desegregation of the armed forces of the United States, not only the Army and the Army Air Forces, but also the Navy. And eventually the Defense Department was created from the War Department and the Navy Department. So that was one thing that changed as a result, partly of the Tuskegee Airmen experience. There's a question about whether the Tuskegee Airmen legacy directly affected Truman's decision to desegregate the armed forces. But I think it did. I think there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that it did, because Truman's first Secretary of the Air Force was Stuart Symington. Stuart Symington was from Missouri. He was a friend of Harry Truman, and he was thoroughly familiar with the Tuskegee Airmen experience. Noel Parrish, who had been commander of Tuskegee Army Airfield during World War II, was very interested in integrating the Air Force when the Air Force became new. As soon as he ceased being leader at Tuskegee Army Airfield because the airfield closed, he went to Air University at Maxwell Air Force Base, and he wrote a thesis as a student at the War College that the Air Force, the new Air Force, should be integrated. He thought that there should be this equal opportunities for black and white pilots, and race shouldn't be a factor in deciding who was a pilot and what unit they were assigned to. The Air Force was already training black pilots with white pilots before Truman's Executive Order 9981 at Williams Air Base, Williams Airfield, which became Williams Air Force Base in Arizona. And that's because Tuskegee Army Airfield, which was training black pilots, closed in 1946. And there were still black pilots being in training, or black cadets who were training to be pilots for the Air Force, but they were training with white pilots at Williams. So the Air Force was already moving toward integration. The first general in the Air Force, black general in the Air Force, was a Tuskegee Airman, Benjamin O. Davis Jr., who had been commander of the 99th Fighter Squadron, later commander of the 332nd Fighter Group, later commander of the 477th Bombardment Group. He was the most famous Tuskegee Airman of all. He had gone to West Point. His father was the first black general in the Army. So Benjamin O. Davis Jr. was the first black general in the Air Force. But there were the first three black generals in the Air Force were all Tuskegee Airmen. So they did have an effect on the Air Force, a beneficial effect on the Air Force, and the Air Force had a beneficial effect on them too. So it was a mutually beneficial system. And the Air Force became very open to the training of black pilots, not only separately, but within the Air Force, being given equal opportunities to train. However, there are still very few black pilots in the Air Force. I think when I checked on it a few years ago, it was only 2% of pilots in the Air Force were black. So there might be a long way to go, not as far as opportunity, but encouraging African Americans to volunteer for the Air Force.
And there was recently in the news some talk about removing you know, I guess parts of training about the Tuskegee Airmen, which is why this topic sort of came up recently. I'm curious, if we're looking at it now, why is that history so important, and getting all of the, not only the information but the facts about it correct?
I heard about that too. For years, the Air Force has incorporated in its training programs information about the Tuskegee Airmen, because it showed not only what the Tuskegee Airmen did in history, but also the importance of including all races in the defense of the United States and recognizing their accomplishments. And so that has long been a part of the training of Air Force units. I was involved in some of that training myself, because I would typically go every few months to Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site at Tuskegee and give a talk about what the Tuskegee Airmen did for the enlisted heritage people. There was an enlisted school at Maxwell Air Force Base, at Gunner Annex Maxwell Air Force Base, but they would have their graduation ceremony at Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site. So the Air Force was encouraging the memory of the Tuskegee Airmen and what they accomplished. I think what happened was recently there was a decision based on the idea that some people had of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs being racially discriminatory. And they wanted, President Trump issued an order that was against those DEI programs. I think somebody interpreted that at Lackland Air Force Base, where the basic training took place for a lot of the Air Force people, as removing all the DEI programming, which included a film about, I think, a video about the Tuskegee Airmen. But that decision to remove the video was quickly reversed. I think within a day or two, the decision was made to put that video back because what the Tuskegee Airmen did was an important element in the history of the Air Force, in the history of the Army Air Forces, in the history of the American military. And it was something that needed to be preserved.
And I'm curious as a historian, are there parts of the history, are there facts, are there certain elements that you don't have the information to, or mysteries that remain in terms of maybe a specific battle or some records that don't exist? Do you have any of those kind of questions lingering?
Well, there were a lot of questions that came up while I was working. I told you I worked at the Air Force Historical Research Agency for 37 years. And for most of those 37 years, I was a historian. And one of my jobs was to answer inquiries. So inquiries kept coming in about different things. For example, who shot down Admiral Yamamoto during World War II? There was a question about which Air Force pilot flying a P-38 on that mission actually shot down Admiral Yamamoto. And there was a question, too, about Lee Archer, whether he was an ace, the first black ace as the Tuskegee Airman or not. And there was a question about what happened to Glenn Miller, the famous American band leader who was in the Army Air Forces during World War II, when he disappeared over the English Channel during World War II. So questions like that would come up all the time. Fortunately, many times we're able to answer those questions by the documentation that's available. But sometimes there's still mysteries to be solved, and I'm sure some of those questions are still coming in.
And I guess as we wrap things up, there are a few kind of recognizable things about Tuskegee Airmen, like the wings, the painted wings. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the lore of that tradition and how it became so iconic.
Well, one of the books I wrote several books about the Tuskegee Airmen. The first one was Tuskegee Airmen, an Illustrated History, which contains a chronology I wrote, but also a lot of pictures and captions and summaries of what the Tuskegee Airmen did. But the second book was the Tuskegee Airmen Chronology, which is an elaboration, an expansion of the chronology that's in the first book. The third book that I want to mention is Misconceptions about the Tuskegee Airmen. There's a lot of misconceptions. And going around, I've been a member of the Tuskegee Airmen Incorporated since 2008, and I've been to 8 of the Tuskegee Airmen National Conventions. And there's a lot of information that I learned that was not really accurate. People thought something was true and it wasn't. One of those pertains to the red tails. The red tails is true. The Tuskegee Airmen painted the tails of their P-51s for their bomber escort missions, painted them red. But the idea that they were the only group that had painted tails to distinguish their aircraft from other aircraft is false, because all of the groups that flew P-51s had distinctively painted tails. There were 4 P-51 groups in the 15th Air Force, for example, and one of them was the 52nd Fighter Group. It had yellow tails. So there were the yellow tails. The 31st Fighter Group had striped red tails. The 325th Fighter Group had black and yellow checkerboard pattern tails. So the idea that the Tuskegee Airmen were the only group that painted their tails a distinctive color because they wanted people to know who they were is not exactly true, because every group had an assigned color so that the bomber formations would know which group was escorted. And that helped them not only in their formations, because sometimes they were flying with more than one fighter group and wanted to know who was who, but it also helped the bomber crews know that they weren't being escorted by German fighters that would shoot them down. It would help tell who was who by the colors of the tails. And of course, some of these missions were classified. And right before the mission went off, the bomber crews would know which groups were escorting them and what the colors of the tails would be, so that they would know whether those aircraft, those fighters, were friend or foe.
And if there is one for you personally, one lesson or legacy or something that you take away from, you know, all of the research that you've done, is there something that you would want people to know, or that's something that you came away with personally about the Tuskegee Airmen and this part of history?
I never really thought about it, but I think one of the most important memories I have is a relationship I had with a Tuskegee Airman named Charles McGee. He was Colonel Charles McGee when I knew him, and then he was eventually promoted, given the honorary promotion of brigadier general. But Charles McGee was very, very admirable, and he was one of the most famous Tuskegee Airmen because not only did he fly fighters in World War II and flew red-tail P-51s to protect bombers, but he also flew fighters in Korea during the Korean War in the 1950s, and he also flew fighters in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. So he flew in 3 different wars for his country, in the Army Air Forces and then in the United States Air Force. He flew a total of 409 combat missions. It wasn't more than any other Air Force pilot in those 3 wars, but it's very exemplary. And I was so glad to have known him for many years. He died at the age of 102 just a few years ago. But I would say one of my most important impressions of the Tuskegee Airmen was getting to know Charles McGee and his family and what he had accomplished. He's an example of somebody who had been giving opportunities and took advantage of those opportunities and fought for his country with honor.
Well, I really appreciate that as sort of a final note to go on. I hope that people will check out the books that you've written. I will leave links to those in the description where they can read and learn more about it. It's really a fascinating history, and I think one that, you know, we can all benefit from learning more about. So I appreciate you for taking the time to be on the podcast and all the research that you've done. Is there anything else that comes to mind that, you know, aside from the books you've written, are you working on anything now or anything that you'd like to share?
Well, there's plenty of Tuskegee Airmen venues that are still going on, and I have the opportunity to speak at different places about the Tuskegee Airmen. And so I'm glad there's still a lot of interest in the Tuskegee Airmen. And I would like to just say that the books I've written about them are available not only on a place like Amazon, but also from the University of Georgia Press. So I would just like to add that.
Sure. I'll leave links and information where everybody can learn more and pick up some of the books. Thank you again for your time. I really enjoyed our conversation, and
Me
uh,
too.
I look forward to learning more. I think it's just a fascinating part of history.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to share my research.
Thank you, Dr. Haulman, for being a guest on the podcast. And thank all of you for listening. Make sure that you check out Dr. Haulman's books that are listed down in the description below. If you're watching on YouTube, that's right under the subscribe and like buttons. And if you're listening to this podcast on audio, on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, wherever you listen to podcasts, Spotify, make sure that you give the foXnoMad podcast a 5-star rating and a couple of kind words. It helps us get the word out about the show. We have some fantastic guests. I'm just really proud of the episodes we've been putting out. So all of your support is very, very appreciated and super, I'm just very thankful for all of that. So thank you all for listening. Thank you, Dr. Haulman, again. And until the next episode, have a great rest of your day.